Okay. Okay, so that one is live. Getting everything set up. If anybody's there, it'll be just a minute. Running behind. Shocker, I know. And you will be hearing my fan in the background. It's too hot not to. He can't be playing videos in here. Okay, and I am live. Make this smaller without affecting it. I should be. Oh, no, it shows it. Darn. Oh, no, it shows on that screen. Just poke it up here. That should work. Oh, actually, I just. Okay. Just waiting for some people to join.
I say hi.
Well, nobody is here yet, so. I think some people are used to me being on at 9. Hello, I see somebody in here. How are you doing tonight? Just waiting for more people to get here before we start the video.
Yeah, for now, if anyone comes through, we'll go for more people and probably do a little bit of talking. So I'm trying to do stuff without just making too much sound. So a while ago, we got this Bible. It was free off of like a certain website, and I'm not sure what version of the Bible it is. Probably is English Standard.
Oh, it was a free Bible that you could order from offline. Well, it looks like we have a couple people here. How are you guys doing tonight?
Maybe we could. No.
Just waiting for more people to come before we get started.
I might talk a little bit.
Hello.
Most of these people might be the God Squad. Who was the first person you joined?
I don't know.
Usually there's a first person who joins.
Did you guys hear about the earthquake in Russia? There's currently a tsunami warning on my coast, and apparently the waves will start around 11:30, and they're expecting them to be a couple feet tall. So even though it's, you know, a tsunami, once it hits us, it won't be devastating or anything. But It's just crazy. It was an 8.8 magnitude in Russia. It's the strongest earthquake ever recorded. That's wild. And some have been saying it was 9. The highest I've seen from a trusted source would be an 8.8, and some are saying 8.7. But everybody is saying it's the strongest one ever recorded. I'm not sure how strong the next, like the runner-up is now. I didn't have time to look into it.
I bet everything will be cleaned up. Just pray.
I'm not worried. How are you guys doing tonight? If anybody needs prayer, let me know. Happy to lift you up.
I was also gonna say something. For anyone who's heard about Minecraft, or at least has played a little bit of Minecraft, it is a little hard. I just got my first set of full iron armor without anyone's help. Okay, maybe a little bit of help. But I'm not really scared of caves a lot anymore. But I still have to take safe measures. Like I use my shield and block because there's always a chance that I will be attacked. I always make sure I'm at full health and able to sprint. So I'm able to like have an upper hand.
Okay, so it looks like we have a few people in here. I'm gonna give it just a few more minutes before I start the first video. And actually, I'm not even sure I'm on the right video, so I'm just gonna see which video this is. It appears to be lagging.
He says, because of this, the king became indignant and very furious, gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And so the decree went forth that wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows. "I have found a man among the exiles." Sorry, went too far. My fault, guys. There you go. Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows. "I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king." The king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answered before the king and said, "As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise man, conjurer, magician, nor diviner are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while on your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turned to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me, other than in any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, that you may understand the thoughts of your mind." All right, so Daniel gets to the point of understanding that he's going to die because the king's upset at all conjurers, magicians, and the sort, and the like. And Daniel was a part of that crowd because Nebuchadnezzar had enlisted him into that work.
It's lagging pretty bad, Kenny.
And in some way, Daniel felt led by the Spirit to know that he had an answer. So he raises his hand and says, before you kill me, can I take a shot? And he goes before the king, and the king says, so you think you can do this? This is my paraphrasing. And Daniel says, well, I can't do this. But there's
Hey, Kenny.
a God in heaven who can do this. And this God in heaven is directing me to show you what your dream means. Now, in all that I just read, there's a couple of key details that we read to find. The first of these is that Daniel...
Hang on just a second. Kind of mute myself for just a second. No.
From that day that they were talking, roughly 600 BC.
Yeah, it's still.
You could try popping it back in.
And he says it also deals specifically
Yeah,
with the
let me
last.
see. Give me just a minute, guys. I'm fixing some things on the video. Okay, hopefully this will be better.
So So this is the roadmap. This
If
is
it
God
isn't
giving
the-
a preview of coming attractions through
Like
Nebuchadnezzar
the
and
limit
Daniel
of the network
of what
power.
the age we're currently a part of will look like. He gave it all the way back in this part of history, and it comes in. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue, and that statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed, all at the same time, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. All right, so first let's note the obvious. We're looking at a statue.
Kenneth, I have to have it open.
So
I mean-
there's a statue in this dream. The centerpiece is a statue. It has divisions, and these divisions are quite strange. To bring people together and do ministry through that connection. Here's an obvious moment of when that happens. So Daniel has he says that this king will have the power to conquer the entire earth. Not just what he knows of the earth, but all of it. He says everywhere that a bird flies, everywhere that an animal exists on earth, it is under Nebuchadnezzar's authority. Jeremiah confirms this, by the way. Jeremiah was a contemporary of Daniel, and he wrote some similar things. And in Jeremiah 27, he wrote this, 27:5. I have made the earth, the Lord speaking here, I have made the earth, the men, and the beasts, which are on the face of the earth, by my great power and by my outstretched hand, and I will give it to the one who is pleasing in my sight. Now, I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant. And I have given him also the wild animals of the field to serve him. All the nations shall serve him, and his son and his grandson, until the time of his own land comes. Then many nations and great kings will make him their servant. So we know that Nebuchadnezzar did not travel to every inch of the globe. But here's what we just learned. Had he done so, he would have conquered every living thing on earth, because God had prepared it for him. God has decreed that it would be so. Isn't that interesting? You don't have to exercise the authority God gives you to have it. And in this case, he had the authority, though he couldn't exercise it to the extent that would have proven it, but it was there. So he is assigned this immense amount of power, one-man government, one-man rule of the whole planet for a period of time. But at the same time, we also heard through Jeremiah, for example, that this rule was not going to last forever. That is to say, that God was going to take Nebuchadnezzar's place away at some point, and others were going to make him their servant. And as a result, we come to understand that in this statue, though it starts with a representation of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, certainly, and Babylon was a very powerful world leader or very powerful empire in its day. It stretched virtually from Europe, present-day Greece, all the way into India, northern Africa. It's quite an expanse to cover in that day, and it ruled to that extent. But in biblical terms, he had rule of the whole planet. But then it was going to come to an end. And so we see from Jeremiah that it wasn't a permanent position of authority, and we see from Daniel, coming back now to the text of Daniel, that he wasn't the last empire of the earth either, because there's still a lot of statue left. Daniel says in chapter 2, verse 39, after you, I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar was loving the prophecy until we got to that verse. After you, there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, and then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. So Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, you're the beginning, but you're not the end. There will be another kingdom, and it will replace you, and then a third kingdom will come along and replace the second one. We're in a series or a sequence of ruling here. So before we look at who the second and third are, you need to understand what you just learned about the statue in and of itself. You just learned that the head of gold stood for one kingdom, and now as we move to a new material, we move to a new kingdom. So each material means a new kingdom. And as such, when you move down from top to bottom on this statue, what you're realizing is this is a timeline. The statue itself represents the passage of time. From a certain moment when Nebuchadnezzar became king to some future moment that we haven't defined yet. So it's a creative way of representing the passage of time. And that passage of time is called the age of the Gentiles. You're looking at the start of the age of the Gentiles. How do we know that this is the beginning of the age of the Gentiles? Well, remember what the definition of the age of the Gentiles is. The people of Israel scattered outside their land, persecuted, enslaved, killed, and the nation of Israel's capital city trampled by Gentiles. The very first time those two things were true in history was when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. Before that, never had happened. Since that has happened, it's never not been this way. It's never been the case that Israel has fully regained a completely peaceful and exclusive control of their capital city. Never has it been the case that Israel has ceased to be persecuted, enslaved, killed, and so on.
What is that?
There have been certainly good periods of history relative to others. There have been bad periods of history relative, but the pattern has not fundamentally changed. So before that moment, when Solomon was king, Israel was the world superpower. They were the most powerful nation in their area of the world. No one challenged Solomon. And in a period of time from then until 605 BC, we move from that state of affairs to Israel entering in the age of the Gentiles. So now we're here to understand how this age proceeds. Knowing now that it has started and how it started, now we're going to look at more of how it proceeds through time. Daniel says the second kingdom will defeat Babylon and yet be inferior to Babylon. The inferiority of the second kingdom is represented by the fact that silver is of lesser value than gold. And we understand why silver is considered less valuable. It's the way we assign value to precious metal. But what does it say about the second kingdom that it's representing? How is the kingdom less valuable than Babylon, so to speak, and yet still able to conquer Babylon? Well, to understand that question, you have to understand what kingdom replaced Babylon in history. Daniel doesn't give us that. At the time that Daniel wrote this, it was still future, even for Daniel. And as we look at possibilities, like what nations might we suggest as options for the next in line? Well, it's not hard to find them, but even if we were to stop before we look, there is a set of rules we can follow that ensure we don't pick the wrong ones. And the rules come out of the age of the Gentiles definition. What are the rules? Well, here are the criteria for whether or not you can be one of the precious metals in the statute. First of all, you got to be a Gentile kingdom. So it's never going to be Israel. Israel's never one of the pieces of the statute for obvious reasons. They're not going to persecute themselves. It's a Gentile persecution period, okay? Secondly, they have to be the dominant power in their day. If you can name a power and I can name a more dominant one, you haven't got the right one. So they've got to be the most dominant power of their day. Thirdly, they have to defeat their predecessor. That's a pretty clear sign. They have to be the one that replaces the one before. And if you're going to fulfill the purpose of the age of the Gentiles, you have to trample Jerusalem, which in my way of saying it is you have to control Jerusalem. You have to invade Jerusalem. And here's a bit of a corollary. If you're going to defeat the predecessor, and the predecessor in this case is Babylon, what land must you also have in order to complete this four-part requirement?
Yeah, thank you.
What if you're going to have to defeat Babylon, what must you have control of? Babylon. So, in other words, you not only have occupation of Jerusalem, you have to occupy Babylon. Because if you want to conquer the United States, you got to take Washington, D.C., right? That's the idea. So, we look for a nation that was able to take, a Gentile nation that was able to take Jerusalem and Babylon in displacing the nation of Babylon, and there's only one, of course, that meets that definition, and that's the Medo-Persian Empire. So the Medo-Persian Empire came along in 550 BC, and that kingdom was formed out of an alliance of the Medes and the Persians, which is why they call it the Medo-Persian Empire, and that's why in the statue, their part of the statue is represented by the two arms. Now, most people who draw the statue have drawn it with arms crossed, but it's interesting, that's not actually in the text. And the arms could be like this, I guess, but I don't mind that they're crossed. I think that's probably appropriate, but the point is just that it's not in the dream. Nonetheless, those two arms represent the Medes and the Persians working together in one kingdom. All right? This kingdom had the power to challenge Babylon in sheer numbers. They were known for overwhelming armies. They would mass millions of men. And even if Babylon had better armament or was more sophisticated in the way that they conducted battle, there's a certain point at which numbers just win. And that was the way that the Medo-Persians did their work. So they were less majestic in that respect, and yet still able to conquer. And to understand how they were less majestic beyond simply that, you have to also understand how they governed. In the case of the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, we've already been told, had complete control over the whole planet, even though he didn't exercise it. But that was never given to Cyrus or Darius or any of the other leaders of the Medo-Persian Empire. So there's no indication that that level of authority was passing down. God started the first with it, but he never gave it to anyone after that. And yet those other nations did conquer. So they conquered, but they did it less majestically. They had less authority. And even in the way they ruled their own people, they had less dominance. Nebuchadnezzar was an absolute despot. He could do whatever he wanted. There were no rules. But in the Medo-Persian way of ruling, kings had power, yes, but they were required to obey or to keep prior precedent, to not change prior kings' rulings, kind of like the way courts work today. That was a kind of a check on their power. So that diminished them to some extent. All right? So we find them to be a lesser kingdom, and yet they managed to conquer. So we now have the Medo-Persians. Third, verse 39, verse 39, Daniel goes on to say a third kingdom will assume power over the world. You notice how quickly he goes through 2 and 3. There'll be a second. Oh, yeah, there'll be a third. The third is also easy to find because it meets there's only one more kingdom now that could meet the definitions we gave a moment ago. And as you probably know, it's the it's the Hellenistic Empire of Alexander the Great. In 330 BC, he rolled from the west into the east like lightning, and he overtook the kingdom that Medo-Persians had. And he's represented by bronze in this statue. And the bronze belly down into the thigh region of the statue. He competed with leaders of city-states to rule. He didn't have the same kind of autocratic rule that the prior 2 kingdoms had. He worked more with local rulers. His real leverage was his army. So he didn't have pure political power, but he had a military that meant basically he got what he wanted as long as he was alive. Notice in this section of the statue, you go from a single piece of the body to 2 now. As you reach into the thighs, there's a split taking place here, and that's part of how the kingdom changes too, because after Alexander the Great died unexpectedly very young, he had no heirs, and so they divided up that large region I showed you earlier on the map into 4 sections, but primarily they divided it east and west, and the generals of his army inherited those 4 regions. The 2 generals that were in the west aligned with each other, and the 2 generals in the east did the same against the other 2, and so you ended up with 2 against 2 in their political division, and that's represented by the dividing of the statue into an east and west, so to speak, with the legs. And the concept of the Western world and the Eastern world originated at that point in history, and it has continued ever since. The historical effect today of talking about West versus East, you just take that for granted. That was not the way the world spoke until the Hellenistic division. But ever since then, it's never gone away. And as you look at the statue, in this age, the legs never come back together again. So it's a reflection of how history has played out. There was a division that has never rejoined.
Okay, so that was that video, and I was having some issues here through it with the screen size, it looks like. Oh yeah, it got all out of whack. I'm going to fix it before we start the next video here. How's everybody doing tonight?
Everyone better be doing good.
Hush. You're a goof.
I'm a goof.
Okay. Yeah, and there is a delay, slightly. Sorry about that. Not too much I can do about it.
Yeah. It's not like we can magically poof make you
Okay.
whatever device you're listening on. Keep your shorts or
Okay. Okay, we just finished that one, so we'll go to session 15. I am going to edit the screen so you guys can see it properly. second here. Moving from one computer setup to another. Everything has to be fixed all over again. Let's see if this works. No, it looks like it's not working. Hang on just a second. I'm not sure what the issue is now. In just a moment. Okay, so now it should be a
It
nicer.
would appear that it shifted a little bit to the right or the left.
Oh, look. Now that I move this on my screen, it changes that completely.
Yeah, because it's completely different.
Okay, well,
You
if
need
I
to have it this on the same.
Alright, so we will get started on this next video. Thank you. Something new to deal with.
Could it fix the cropping? Because it's cutting off a big portion.
All right,
of the
Daniel's
left half of the
interpretation
screen.
raced through those
I
two
guess it doesn't
because,
matter when
frankly,
I do this.
they don't matter.
Yeah.
They only matter because they connect the first to the
Is it
last.
cutting the top? It's
They
cutting the head off.
give you confidence to know that you're interpreting
Yeah,
it
I
correctly,
kinda went fast on
but they're
that.
not the point. The point of this, as you might imagine, is at the ends. You want to know when the age starts, and you're really interested to know how it ends, because you're part of it. And that's where this is going. The last is the most interesting and the most important. The fourth kingdom. Now, next week when we come back into this, we'll look at another chapter of Daniel, but we're only going to look at the fourth kingdom in that chapter because this is the point. The fourth kingdom gets the most treatment in this chapter for good reason. Look at the next section here. I'll just mark here where what we learned, that the Greek Empire now represents down to the end of the brass area, the bronze area.
Thank you.
And now in chapter 2, verse 40. Then there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron.
No.
Inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom. But it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong, some will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. The final kingdom that we're now studying here, the fourth one, features these interesting materials combining together, the least valuable by far, and this very strange combination of strength and brittleness, strength and lack thereof. And if you notice also, it has a tendency to break apart and then be recombined again, because pottery, if it's made wet, it can be refashioned. So this kingdom replaces the ones that came before it, but it does so in a very unique way. And this is where you have to pay a lot of attention to the details, or you start to miss the change. You start to apply the pattern that you've witnessed in the first three. You just, without thinking, you apply it to the fourth one, but you can't, because he just said the fourth one's different. The fourth one doesn't operate by the same rules that the first three did. It only operates the same in the sense that it's part of the same statute. But it does its own thing. Rather than holding territory together as the previous kingdoms have done, under a single government, a single ruler, a single name, that's changed. That's not the case anymore. He says this one breaks apart and then recombines and then crushes and breaks apart and then comes back together. And sometimes it's strong and some parts aren't. It's a mess. But collectively, these pieces work together to continue the fulfillment of the age of the Gentiles. Collectively, and when I say collectively, I don't mean that they do it necessarily with any organization. I'm not saying that they're any more consciously working on it than Nebuchadnezzar was conscious of his role to rule the whole world. I'm saying that God uses them to accomplish that outcome, though they themselves aren't necessarily privy to it. The effect of this, though, is you have a kingdom whose various pieces combine and decompose over time, yet consistently what they do is they prevent the rise of Israel. Consistently, they hold Israel under the penalties that God has imposed through the age of the Gentiles. It continues to exist until such time as the statue itself no longer is in existence. And what kind of earthly kingdom would fit this unique set of details? Where do we begin? Well, we know where the fourth kingdom starts simply because we know where the Hellenistic Empire ended. So history gives us that answer. We know it was the Roman Empire that came along and displaced the Hellenistic Empire in about 168 BC. Rome eventually defeats Judea, present-day Jerusalem, Israel, in 63 BC. So technically, if you're looking at the terms that we've established for the age of the Gentiles, when did Rome finally become the displacing power? In 63 BC. By that point, they had already conquered Babylon, and now they had taken Jerusalem. So in all four cases, these kingdoms had met the same criteria. They had all held the land of Jerusalem. They all held the land of the previous kingdom, which included Babylon. And they were Gentile nations trampling over Israel. Rome did that in 63 BC, and it continued to expand for centuries after that. And then it started to change. And as Rome began to conquer and expand and then weaken and then be infiltrated by other nations seeking to reclaim that land, it began to go through a very dramatic series of transformations over hundreds of years. We talk about the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire, and people cannot accurately date the end of the Roman Empire. If you've wondered why there is no such date, it's because it did not end. Not in the traditional sense. It added territory by assimilating cultures and lands. It changed the culture in some cases. It was iron in the sense that the Romans were completely intolerant of any kind of resistance or any insurrection, any kind of fight against their power. They were ruthless in that regard. You know, the story of Masada. You had, 100 and something people sitting on the top of a rock. Who cares, right? No, the Romans, they cared. They built a ramp the size of a 25-story building to get up there just because they wanted to make sure no one could tell them that they couldn't do it. That no one was going to stand in their way. That's who Romans were. All right. So as that empire expanded and then began to change, what took its place? Where are we now in the fourth kingdom, so to speak? Well, exactly what Daniel said happened. Exactly. It started to fracture. It started to break into pieces. And you get to something over a period of centuries called the Holy Roman Empire, which is the basis of modern Europe. And yes, the name Rome went away, Romans went away. Rome became just a city within a single nation at a point in time. But that's where you need to divorce yourself from terminology and look at what Daniel actually said. Daniel said that you should expect this entity to be like different pieces matched together that really don't match. And because of that, they keep breaking up. They have a European Union, and then they have a Brexit. And then they have the, Ottoman Empire, and then they get rid of that, and then they have the, some Germanic Empire, and then some Austrian Empire, and then Nazism comes along, and then that goes away, and then it's the exact thing that Daniel said would happen in Europe. And the same thing's been happening, by the way, in the Middle East and parts of Africa. There is no stability to the national borders of these places. There is, you have the Bosnian conflict, you had the Balkan Wars at times, you've had, the Cold War, you've had nations become part of the Eastern Bloc and then fall out of the Eastern Bloc. I mean, you couldn't have written it better than in the few verses that Daniel provided for us in chapter 2. It's exactly what has been happening. What is the collective effect, though, of all of that happening? You still have Israel outside the land. Britain was over it for a while. The Ottomans were over it for a while. Others have come and gone. And Israel has now recently been able to establish a presence there again, which we'll come back to later in this study. But my point is that the effect of all of that is to continually provide for the age of the Gentiles and what it requires. It just doesn't come under the banner of one national name. But Daniel told you not to look for that. He told you to look for something different. So what we have now, and by the way, the Holy Roman Empire, people don't realize this, the Holy Roman Empire didn't cease to exist until the 19th century, until something else came along. I mean, that just shows you how effective that institution has been at holding itself together in one form or another. So here we have a problem now. We have this statue with the fourth kingdom, but we got to call it something. What are you going to call it? People sometimes call it the Roman Empire. The problem with that is that's just where it began. That's not where it is. Some have tried to find some other entity like the Catholic Church or something else to pin it on. Here again, what they're looking for is what they can't have. They're looking for a single entity that they can sum up the kingdom with, but Daniel has told us you can't do that. It's at the very end going to be a divided kingdom of 10. And even now it's not one, it's two. It's two legs. There's no such thing as one name here. So we have to come up with something that's a little more general. And the name I would propose to you, the one I like to use, is this is a period of history in which imperialistic democratic alliances. You don't like it? Come up with a better one. I'll take it. But it's a period in which you have imperialism is when one nation goes out and establishes another vassal, another part of the world as its own possession, but then leaves the culture intact, leaves the people there, just rules them from a distance. That's imperialism. And it's democratic in that you see these nations coming together and leaving and coming together and leaving. Why? Because the people keep changing their minds on what they want to do. Or they keep shifting their alliances one to another. You get that kind of breaking apart and recombining because you do not have absolute power, because you do not have monarchs who can make decisions without challenge. Because it's imperialistic and democratic, it keeps changing. But behind the scenes, you have an all-knowing, all-powerful God sovereignly deciding that this entity will serve his purpose in retaining or continuing the age of the Gentiles. That's how you have to understand this. All right. Now, let's understand how this age comes to an end. Daniel says in verse 44, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put to an end all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of a mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So this dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy." All right, here's the final piece from Daniel tonight. He says that ending scene that the king saw, that scene in which the rock comes out of the heavens and crushes the statue at the feet, he said that's actually representative of a new kingdom coming, another kingdom. Notice he says this kingdom is set up by God, not by man. Notice also he says this kingdom will not be left for another people to take over. This kingdom will endure forever. And then finally, you notice he also says that this kingdom will crush and put to an end all these kingdoms. Now that's kind of interesting when you think about it, because of all of those kingdoms we've studied so far, how many of them will be around at the point when this must happen? How many are still around now? How many are around at any given time? At any given time, there was only one of them. That's the nature of a timeline. It's moving in time. So pick a point on the timeline. You're only going to be pointing at one, wherever you are. So he says this rock will destroy all of them. How can you interpret that? How do we understand that then? It must mean that he's saying it will put an end to the age of the Gentiles. The statue in its totality doesn't represent one kingdom. It represents this whole age of kingdoms. And so to say that this coming kingdom will destroy the whole statue is a way of saying it puts an end to the age. It doesn't just stick on the bottom of it and become yet another piece of it. It puts an end to it. So that's the phrase that clues us in to know this event, this rock, whatever it is the event that actually ends the age and allows the next age to begin. All right, so this is what we're learning, how our age ends. And it ends here because he says you have this rock coming down from heaven. Now, we know this stone cannot be another Gentile nation. How do I know that? Well, we just said it ends the age of the Gentiles. It ends the age that is defined as a period of Gentiles having prominence. So if the time in which Gentiles have prominence is going to end, what is a non-Gentile? There's only one answer to that. It's a Jew. So this has to be a Jewish kingdom. If it were any other Gentile empire, under any other terms, any other conditions, then you would still be in the age of Gentiles. So if he says this one puts an end to the statue, he's saying this one puts an end to the age. If he's putting an end to the age of the Gentiles, he's putting an end to Gentiles ruling over Israel. He must be setting up a Jewish kingdom. And that means he's also putting an end to things like the trampling over of the city and the persecution of Gentiles and the enslavement of Gentiles. And that means he's putting an end to their being scattered outside the land. Those are all features of the age of the Gentiles. If they're all coming to an end, their opposites are all coming true. And this kingdom, he says, will be set up by God himself. Daniel says it's represented by an uncut stone. Now, uncut means not worked by human hands, not fashioned by a stone cutter. Where in the Bible do you hear that being mentioned? Why is that important? You might be thinking of something in the law. In Deuteronomy, when God tells the nation of Israel how to build their stone altars, he makes it very clear that those altars cannot use stones that have been worked by human hands. They must be uncut, natural. Now, the reason for that, out of Deuteronomy, let me read it for you. He says in Deuteronomy 27:5, "You shall build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall not wield an iron tool on them. You shall build the altar of the Lord your God of uncut stones, and you shall offer burnt offerings to the Lord your God." Here's why he's using uncut stone. What's an altar? What's it for? Place of sacrifice. It's the place you take an animal and you sacrifice it, all right? As an aside, this is why churches do not have altars, and nor should we ever refer to anything that's in our churches as an altar, because what you're saying is that's a place of sacrifice. And Jesus has made the once and forever sacrifice for us. There is no more need for sacrifice. So we don't want an altar because we don't need it.
Okay, brother, we get it.
Right?
Carry on.
If you have a flat thing on your stage, what do you call it? The table. Don't call it an altar. Sorry, pet peeve of mine. So what is an altar? It's a place of sacrifice.
Backwards?
So God is talking about a place of sacrifice. What are sacrifices for? Why does God institute them? What is their purpose? They are a means of atoning. Blood is the atonement, right? So one life given to cover the sin or the debt of another. And so a sacrifice is for atonement. So when God told the nation of Israel, you're going to practice ritual atonement. You're going to practice ritual sacrifice, and it's going to teach you about atonement. It's going to teach you about sacrifice and so on. But I don't want you doing it on altars you built for yourself, because that sends the wrong message. It says you participate in your own atonement. It says you contribute to your own salvation. I worked the stone, I added my work to the process of making a sacrifice, and so it communicates bad theology. It says you have a part to play in your own atonement. We don't. We take stones God fashioned, i.e. natural stones, and we just throw them on a pile like you see in that picture, and yeah, it's not flat and it doesn't look pretty to us, but that's the point. As soon as you try to start making what God does pretty, you ruin it. So it's what God alone does that is the point, and so our stones are to be uncut. That's in the way the law required Israel to do what he asked them to do. But in the fact that he's using that term now, what he's suggesting is that this stone is not something prepared by men, not something humans have done. This is something God alone has done. And that uncut stone becomes then something very important. It begins to symbolize something. If you add it all up, for example, you have a Jewish kingdom. You have a Jewish kingdom that rules the whole earth. A Jewish kingdom ruling the whole earth above all Gentile nations. One that comes at the end of this age and starts the next age. And it begins by a uncut stone, or let's call it the rock, that comes from heaven. I mean, is it not obvious what we're talking about, right? So that rock comes, and it hits at what point on the statue? Why is it important that it's hitting at the feet? The feet represent the end of the age. So in timeline, in terms of the timeline, when does the rock come? At the end of the age. So the rock is Jesus, if you hadn't already figured that out. He is the one who returns. This is his second coming. Daniel is prophesying on the Lord's second coming. What's interesting, of course, is that at that point in history, they didn't know there would be a second coming. He was prophesying, now we know, the second coming of Christ. Because the current age was the age when he was here for the first coming. He's the one who said, we are in the age of the Gentiles. He was alive. He had already come at that point. So if he was alive and he's saying it's the age of the Gentiles, then by definition, his first coming did not put an end to it. It was still happening. So it's his second coming that puts an end to it. And that's what we're waiting for. All right? So as we stand here in history, the coming of that rock is the next milestone in God's prophetic plan. Notice the statue. How much of the statue has already come to pass? Effectively, all of it, but for the toes. But for the toes. So when the toes appear, the rock can appear. But we know that. That is to say, there's no more revelation necessary. All that we need to know has been given. We're just waiting for it to finish. Therefore, we are in the last days. Nothing more that we need to know in order for this to come to pass. Okay? So, let's just sum it up. The rock, not hard. The toes, what does it not specifically what it represents, but in the sense of the statue overall, what does it represent? Right, the end of the age. And lastly, that mountain that grows out of the coming of the rock. Mountains in Scripture have a certain symbolic meaning, and we've talked about this in the past here. How do you find the symbol's meaning? You go back and you look at how it's used in Scripture. It was given in the actual context here. What was the context? It's a kingdom. He says in that verse, a kingdom will come, God will set up a kingdom. And that's the interpretation of what was the image. The image from earlier in the chapter was you saw a rock, it came and it grew into a mountain that filled the whole earth. Now we have the interpretation. That was a kingdom filling the whole earth. So there's your confirmation that mountain is kingdom. Okay, so here's where we are. We know that the church is a part of the last days of an age. The age is now called the age of the Gentiles. We sit at the last days of it, and we're not just in the last days. You know, James and the writer of Hebrews, we're in the last days. We're in the last of the last days. We're in the seventh of the seven. We're at the last 2-minute warning of the 2-minute warning of the last period. It could still go on for a while, but we're at the end. Friends, welcome back to our Revelation study. And I know because we haven't been here for a little while, we want to catch up on some things we did 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I guess it is now, and make sure that we're all on the same page as we move forward now into the rest of what we have in this book. We're going to be doing some things outside the book of Revelation tonight, much as we did last week. Next week we'll come back into it, but even then we'll take time again shortly thereafter to dive back out. We're going to do this a little bit, just for a few weeks, because there is some important background, not in the book, elsewhere in the Bible, that has to be something you understand if you're going to understand what we're going to go do in the book of Revelation. So let's start that review here. We've moved through the first 2 sections of the book of Revelation. That's according to how John divided those sections out. You remember we did this in the first few weeks of our study, and we don't need to repeat it. You see the slide. But we've studied the things that John saw in the first chapter, which was largely the vision of Jesus, of course. And in that, we saw him receive his commission. And in this commission, he was going to write what he sees. And that chapter gave us confidence to know that the contents of this revelation were trustworthy. And then we studied the things that are, which comprise chapters 2 and 3, and the 7 letters that Jesus wrote to the churches. And particularly, we focused on the fact that these are prophetic, that in addition to their literal truth, they also foretell 7 phases that the church will pass through during its time on earth, during its history. And we studied those 7 periods, or at least in passing we did, and we focused on the 7th. And in that letter, we learned that we are the generation currently living in the last of those 7 periods within the church. And that means we're in the apostate church, we're in the false teaching church, we're in the church that has unbelief rampant within the body, so to speak. And so the times that are, which is was the way Jesus described that second part, they are the times that are, because they will remain present tense, are, until there is no church anymore. And then, and only then, will we have moved past part 2 and into the third part of the book of Revelation, the events that pick up after the things that are. So this period of the church, this thing I call the church age, this period between parts 1 and 2 is a...
I should mention that in these videos, he is teaching from a pre-trib stance. We have varied schools of thought within our main members here on this channel. But it's still really good information, so whether you believe pre-trib, post-trib, doesn't really matter for the rest of the information.
Bridge. It's a bridge in the book of Revelation that bridges the moment that John saw what he saw in first century Judea, or first century Asia Minor specifically. It bridges that until we get to those things that happen after the church age, the things which are in chapters 4 and onward. So this period of the things that are moves us into the future. Now, we're not physically experiencing anything outside of this age yet. We're still in this age. So at this point, we're now going to start studying things yet to come for the most part. But as we said last week, before we can move into the things yet to come, the things that will follow the church, we have to gain a better perspective historically on what God is doing at all. And in other words, if we're going to understand how he ends the age, we need to understand how and why he began it. Because God is not a God of random behavior. Everything he does has purpose. And so he established this age for a reason. It makes sense then that the way it will come to completion is connected to its purpose for existence. And so we're going to watch how this thing came to pass by studying its beginnings. And we did that, as you remember, looking backward in time, looking at what we see in the book of Daniel. Daniel is the book that tells us about this period of history that the church occupies, and more than just the church, of course. It's a much longer period of time. And we studied chapter 2 last time we were here, and tonight we're going to open up in chapter 7. Both of these chapters are chapters that establish the age of the Gentiles. This is the period of history that God is working in right now, and that name reflects its purpose. Jesus gave us that name out of Luke 21, and the purpose of the age is to make a period of history in which Israel will be under judgment. This is a period of history for Israel's judgment while on earth. And understanding this period of history is absolutely essential to understanding anything you read in the book of Revelation, particularly in chapters 4 and onward. Because the events of Revelation are actually the culmination and the fulfillment of the things that God has appointed for Israel in this age. And it's going to happen to us time and time again, not just tonight, not just next week, but time and time again. I'm going to refer back to the age of the Gentiles and everything you're learning from last time we met and tonight. So if you didn't see last time we met, go online, watch it, please. And then when you pay attention to tonight, you put the two together, you're going to have some important background. And don't think it's just going to be in your head and then out. You're going to hear about it over and over again, because it is literally the key to understanding some important things in the book of Revelation. So Jesus told us in Luke 21 that our current age is the age of the Gentiles. And he said this age would be marked by 3 circumstances for Israel. And the first of these, in this present age that we're in, the first of these present age circumstances would be that Israel would be subjugated to Gentile powers. And so in this present age, we have 3 definitions we have to carry through. As long as these 3, the first being that Israel is subjugated, as long as these 3 are true, then the age is still present. Remember, we said the church occupies the last days of this present age. So we've only seen the very last piece of it. It's been going on before that. So we want to get to the age of the Gentiles conversation, and we want to know what will stop the age of the Gentiles, and it will simply be the reversal of 3 factors that began it, the 3 things we learned last time, which was that the age of the Gentiles is Israel subjugated to Gentile powers. I'll put these on the screen. And that those Gentile powers would, and this is actually getting ahead here, sorry, just leave that up there for a second. The Gentile powers would subjugate Israel, they would scatter the people, and they would trample Jerusalem. So you have 3 things: Israel being subjugated to Gentiles, Israel being scattered outside her land, Israel's capital city being trampled, being controlled by Gentile powers. Those things define the age. When the age began, it's because Nebuchadnezzar, as you remember, brought those 3 things into existence. And until all 3 are reversed, the age exists. We have to reverse all 3. And we began looking at world powers that fit that definition. We found 4 world powers that fit these 4 requirements for the age of the Gentiles. And Daniel 2 gave us an overview of these 4. And you remember it was a statue that he used, that God used in a dream, that symbolically represented the age of the Gentiles. This is still review, and we're finishing up with the review here. So we have a statue, and in this statue there were 4 parts to the statue, and each of these parts represents one of the 4 kingdoms that were said to be coming during the age of the Gentiles, right? The last thing we see in the dream is a rock that falls from heaven, uncut by human hands. That rock destroys the statue, and as it falls at the feet, which represents
looks like I'm having some
the end of the timeline,
issues here.
it establishes a new kingdom, a mountain that this new kingdom is a mountain eventually that fills the whole earth. All of that picturing Jesus falling to finish the age of the Gentiles and establish a Jewish kingdom. Now, if you haven't been here, you're already lost, and that was expected. All right, you can't catch up in 10 minutes, but you can go back online and catch up. But here's what we just realized through that chapter of Daniel: that as long as we're waiting for Christ, we're going to be in a time of Gentile domination over Israel. And what will fix that is not peace in the Middle East or any political solution. What fixes that is Jesus' return, because God has intended that his people be under subjugation until that moment. At his second coming, he puts a kingdom in place that is a Jewish kingdom. And as a result, it fixes all three elements that define the age of the Gentiles. No longer is Israel going to be subjugated to Gentiles. They're going to be the chief nation on the earth. No longer is Israel going to be scattered outside their land. All living Jews will be in their land. And thirdly, no longer will the city of Jerusalem be trampled by any Gentiles. It'll be the home of Jesus. So those three things get fixed.